I'm honored to introduce historian and educator Dr. Maurice Jackson and his new book on Georgetown University's press, Rhythms of Resistance and Resilience, How Black Washingtonians Used Music and Sports in the Fight for Equality. Professor Jackson teaches in the History and African American Studies Department at Georgetown University. He's the author of Let This Voice Be Heard and DC Jazz. Both titles we have tonight. Rose is here. Clint is here, and please check those out as well. He was the inaugural chair of the Washington D.C. Commission on African American Affairs, appointed by the mayor. As a witness to the city's history, the book tells the story of musicians and athletes who have used their skills and their determination to achieve success in the face of discrimination. Famously, Washington, D.C. is the birthplace of Duke Ellington. He famously stated there are simply two kinds of music, good music and the other kind. Professor Jackson knows all kinds of music. Many of the musicians he writes about, Shirley Horn, Marvin Gaye, Chuck Brown, were innovators and icons of Washington, D.C. and music history. You will find the history of D.C. sport figures, including Georgetown University basketball coaching legend John Thompson Jr. And those famous players, Patrick Ewing and Allen Iverson, are in the book as well. Professor Jackson says in the nation's capital, music and sports have played a central role in the lives of African Americans, often serving as a barometer of social conflict and social progress. This fascinating study includes a reference to Charles Douglas, the son of social reformer abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who helped organize two black baseball teams in 1867. Also, again, I will ask Maurice, hopefully when he's not traveling the world, that he'll do another class for us. But this book really touches the social fabric of the community, the neighborhoods, the places that people come together in Washington. Music and sports are vital to life, to his life, and so are the stories of racial solidarity that he talks about in the book. The celebrated Washington, D.C. poet E. Ethelbert Miller says, very well in the foreword, Jackson writes from the heart. I think everybody in D.C. should read this book. Local history is universal history. We're going to promote this book. Maurice, you've done a wonderful job. Please join me in welcoming the distinguished Dr. Maurice Jackson to the Politics and Prose community. Thank you.
If I were going to give a lecture, I'd stand there, but I'm just going to tell a bunch of stories. So you don't mind sitting down. It's great. Thank you, Barbara. You know, Politics and Prose, you know, we knew it. I knew when Carla and her husband first started up on Connecticut Avenue, and we've just been dear friends since then. And so thank you all for coming. But especially I have some of my former students, Ella, Lee, even, who graduated from Georgetown in the last couple of years, and just going to Oxford, finished University of Pennsylvania graduate school. So I'm just very happy that students are here and the friends are here. And you know, I've been lucky with this book. I've spoken at quite a few places, and I'm glad that people really want to get it. And so I start this book, I tell stories. And I talk about the reasons that I wrote the book. And so I tell you one that's partially true and one that's absolutely true. The one that's partially true is that the other summer, my wife and kids and I were in Cambridge, Maryland. We were walking down the path that Harriet Tubman walked. And you know, Harriet Tubman walked at night with going to stars of the North Star, and how she did it in night with all these dogs upon her is just miraculous. But we walked the trail, and the fact that she walked this and led hundreds of people to freedom, and then went to the store where she had been hit. As you know, she developed epilepsy from that. So I had this imaginary story, and I grew up loving Louis Armstrong. Well, I didn't really love Louis Armstrong at first. What happened was that I was of the generation, with the Black Power generation, we thought Louis Armstrong was clowning a little bit too much. And then we did something that we hadn't done. We listened to it. When we listened to him, we knew how stupid we were, because this was the greatest musician. Tony Bennett says, you asked me about American music. It starts with two words: Louis Armstrong. Bing Crosby, who never spoke about anybody, said he's the beginning and the end of American music. And Dizzy Gillespie says simply, "Know you, know me." So I'm thinking about this conversation with Louis Armstrong, and then I'm thinking about Satchel Paige. Satchel Paige was both a great ball player, but one of the great storytellers. If you want to know great stories, you know who you listen to? You listen to managers of baseball teams, or baseball players. You know why? Because they travel so much. In the old days, they would go, in summers, they go to Puerto Rico, or spring, off-season, they go to Puerto Rico, Dominican, and they spoke languages. They spoke, Tommy Lasorda spoke fluent Japanese and Italian. Yogi Berra, Casey Stinger, all these old ones spoke Spanish. And Satchel Paige, if he didn't speak many languages, he made you think, because he was just this great. And those were the days, not like the lies we have in politics now. We have nothing but lies. But those people would tell tales for fun. And so they were harmful. And so I tell a story about this, and then about Harriet Tubman, who was known to come to Frederick Douglass's church at Metropolitan Church and just tell these great stories. Oh, Frederick, we went there. And they'd have these big laughs. And then as I'm thinking about those, I think about as a kid living in the South, and there was this man, Burr Pace. And Burr Pace was perhaps the greatest. I was telling someone, it's something about stories. When you're 20 or 30 or 40, you're telling stories. I played football. I scored 5 touchdowns in one game. By the time you're 40 or 50, those 5 touchdowns I scored 10 touchdowns. So they become, but they're still harmless. But Brother Pace told these stories. And he could outthrow Buck Leonard. He could play a trumpet better than Louis Armstrong. And I started thinking about all these stories I'd heard. So then something else happened. This is the truth. That was partly true, and true because of the imagination. But then I'd written this very long book on Washington, D.C., and the publisher said it's too long, cut. So I cut it, said it's too long, and cut. So I had this section on music and sports, and this was the sections that I knew I could take out. It could freestand, though I could leave sections in the book. So I decided that I could do this, and I could talk about, the ordinary man and woman of this city. And so started off with Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass, as you know, ended up in Washington, D.C. He had been a slave, of course, and he worked as a ship captain at the Baltimore Navy Yard. He, in fact, helped start the first black Navy Yard. And he worked and I had worked on ships, so I had some affinity with him. So he ended up here after the Civil War, and he had 2 sons, several sons, but his oldest son was named Charles. Charles came here because he had been one of the first people to sign up for the 54th Regiment, military regiment. And he came to Washington to work as the Reconstruction Bureau, as a federal worker. See, listen now, pay attention, federal worker. So as we hear now, if you know anything about the old days, you know that when people became federal workers, they say, I got a GGJ, a good government job. And what did that job do? It helped people provide for their family, but also it provided services. And I'll go back in that a little bit. So Frederick Douglass' son, and Douglass had been what? He had been the assistant postmaster, and he had been assistant treasurer, pianist jobs. So he came here, and his son, who after he got mustered out of the 54th, hero of the war, came here and worked at the Reconstruction Bureau. But on his spare time, he formed baseball teams. And he formed baseball teams at something called the White Lot. And the White Lot is right in front of the White House. And there, black and white played ball, not on the same team, but played, And there was baseball, and and they also played cricket. And cricket came from you want to have a seat, man? You make me nervous standing like that. Why don't you have a seat? It's all right. We won't hurt you. So Douglass came, Charles came, and he's formed these leagues. Now, around a couple of years before, in Philadelphia, something called the Free African Society had formed. And it had formed because Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, the founders of the modern African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Episcopal Church, had founded this church because when they went to pray in Philadelphia, they could always pray in the congregational churches, but then at a certain time, the white says, no, you must leave. And so these two gentlemen were praying one day, and the man said, you must leave. And they said, let me finish praying, then we'll go and we'll find our own. So they went out and found their own churches. Well, same thing happened with Douglas here. He's playing there, and now they don't let them play on the same lot. So they go and find their own place to play. And they play these things. Now, Charles Douglas' son is named Joseph. Joseph Douglas is the love of Frederick Douglass's life of all his grandchildren. And Joseph takes up the violin, and Frederick sends him off to Oberlin, and then he sends him off to Germany to study the violin. And he wants to be this great but it's in Washington, D.C., and it's in Europe, and he comes back and he cannot get a job. So he goes to Howard University, and Howard University becomes the first tenured black professor of music in the country. And as many of you all know, the picture, you see Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass is on his deathbed. The day before he dies, he comes in, and Joseph comes in. He plays Rock of Ages, songs like that. That's Douglass right there in Cedar Hill. So he had this story about how music comes. Now, in the midst of all this, it's a man named James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1885. He comes to Washington, and he lives at 300 B Street. Now, who lives at 300 B Street? 303 B Street, John Philip Sousa. Now, you all, did anybody see the special in 60 Minutes the other day about the, so this administration, I think you saw that 30 of the best classically trained musicians, young musicians, were to come to Washington to play with the Marine Corps Band. Now that is an honor. Marine Corps bands, it's not for, the Marine Corps bands, these aren't just musicians, these are excellent musicians. Many of them, especially black guys like John Coltrane, who played with the orchestras, who come out and become great. And so they brought these 30 musicians who wanted to come, and somehow the Dodge, that's how you say Dodge, the Dodge comes out, and now how can you be a patriot if you are going to say that the greatest musicians, and some of the greatest musicians in the country who play for these Marine and other bands, that their followers cannot come to Washington because it breaks the DEI, because many of them were minority kids. So Georgetown University opened its doors, and 60 Minutes brought in these musicians to play. And in the midst of it, all of these musicians come who had retired from the Navy and Air Force Band. And I come as Kenny Durham, some of the great jazz musicians had been, in these military bands. So but they come to play the music of Sousa. Sousa taught James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe becomes one of the great band leaders. James Reese Europe leaves Washington because everybody has to leave Washington. If you're a great musician, why are you going to stay here? If you're a great sport, you don't stay, you leave. I come to Washington years ago, and when I come, I don't know, why would I want to stay in Washington? What? When I came, it was just an awful place, in my opinion. I wanted to get to New York. But then I'm trying, then I meet this lady, Laura here, and I end up staying. But, so this new book another book I finished called Halfway to Freedom. Washington was halfway to freedom for slaves, but also for people like me. Well, anyway, Sousa left. And when he leaves, he goes to New York, and he founds something called the Clef Club. Now, in Washington, there had been something called the Treble Clef Club. The Treble Clef Club was a group of high-class, light-skinned black women who sing at Howard University. Howard University did not allow any music besides classical music until the 1970s. You could not play at Howard University classical music. Shirley Horn learned classical music there, but she could not play jazz. So in the midst of this, James Reese Europe goes and he founds this orchestra of 125 people. Anybody know the difference between an orchestra and a band? Those of you musicians. What is that? Oh, well, an orchestra has strings and other and the band is jazz, except for the double bass. So he forms this with all these 18 violins, 18 others, and he forms this band, and Du Bois says he has the organizational skills of Sousa. And out of this, he forms the first, I have to get this straight because it's Gigolos Union. Yeah, Gigolo is a musician, Gigolo is, you know, so he forms the first Gigolo. And he has these 125 musicians. Many of those are from Puerto Rico and other places like that. The Second War comes, and he goes off and joins the the Harlem Hellfighters, the enfant perdu, this, you know, in French, they lost children, and forms this and goes to Europe and starts playing. Well, as he's playing in Europe, there at this time, as he's playing in Europe, he leads the Harlem Hellfighters, this black regiment that doesn't lose any soldiers, and he's laid up in the hospital, gets malaria or something, and the company commander says, I want you to go in this band. I want you to put together this, we need to lift the morale of the troops. So James Reese Europe said, well, you know, we haven't played in a month. Well, the commander says, you better play. And when the commander says something, you know, the military, you do what they say. And he joined this. And all of a sudden, they're going all over France, and they're playing. And the French look at him this way. Something is wrong. They listen to this, they can't figure it out. And then all of a sudden, he plays a couple of notes, and they realize he's playing the Marseillaise, the French song. And jazz music never left after that. So you have all of these things. Concurrently, you have classical music that's picking up. A woman named Madame Ivante, Lillian Evans. And Lillian Evans is classically trained. She comes and she plays, and she goes to Germany and places like that. But she too cannot sing at a public place in Washington. So what do? She sings. They put a barge in the middle of the Potomac because you see, you can sometimes come into federal places where there's somewhat integrated, but you can't integrate in Washington per se on land. So they could sing. They're singing a barge there, and this gave people other ideas. I come back to those later. So you have the midst of this music is just has a great influence. Then in the midst of this, a couple of years later, you have an event that we all know so much about. This is the Marian Anderson concert. Marian Anderson is a contralto, classically trained at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. She's learned Italian, she's learned German, she knows the languages of classical music. Every year she'd come to Washington to perform at Dunbar High School. Dunbar High School was, you know, right over near the Georgetown Law School, second and near the the homeless shelter there. But it's Dunbar High School is too small, so they want to get another place for her to perform, to raise money for young African Americans in the classical music. So what happens? They want to go to the Constitution Hall, because Constitution Hall is the biggest performing place in Washington. Well, the Daughters of the American Revolution own it and say, no, you can't sing here because you are of the Negro race. You can't play. And so they bring people, Doxy Wilkerson and others, form the Marian Anderson Committee, and they put together to try to find a place. Well, they want to perform at what is called Central High School. Central High School, now it's Cardozo High School. They are denied the right to sing there. So they decide that they consult with the First Lady, perhaps our greatest First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and they said they're going to sing on the Mall. So if you wonder why all these demonstrations are always held on the Mall, because the first demonstration with Marian Anderson in 1939. Now, 39 is a very interesting year because in 1936 there had been the rape of Abyssinia, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, and there had been big mobilization in Washington. So people knew they could mobilize. They started mobilizing for that same spirit, the anti-fascist spirit. The Falangists are trying to take over, the overthrow of the Republican forces in Spain. So in the midst of this comes this. So they recruit two people, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt and Harold Ickes, who's the Secretary of the Interior, and they get this place. Now, this is how racism works in Washington. If you were black, you could sit in Constitution Hall, but you couldn't perform. But you could perform at the National Theater, which is right in front of the Wilson Center, but you couldn't sit. And this is just and so what they figured out, they would have this concert there. She sang 75,000 there on the mall. She sings Ave Maria. She sings a Negro spiritual singer. He's got the whole world in his hands, sings all these songs, and it's broadcast throughout the world. Do you know the other day when they have these young people who the administration denies the right to perform the music of Sousa? They were going to perform somewhere in front of 2,000. When they went on 60 Minutes, they went to millions. And the same thing happened with Mary Anderson. She was to sing in the Constitution Hall. They denied it, and it's broadcast throughout the world. And of course, you know that Paul Robeson had engineered this because Paul Robeson had always sang to Irish soldiers and Scottish coal mines and things like that. So but I did not realize until I finished this book that this event in 1939 really was the first opening salvo for the end of discrimination proper in Washington, D.C. Now, so they could demand that the federal lands be integrated, but the city itself was still under Republican rule, and it was still under racist rule, and we saw this especially when Woodrow Wilson had been president. He resegregated many parts of Washington. So you have all this going on at the same time, and I'll come back to further things. Now, it's the same thing is currently happening in sports. In sports, in the early 19th century, a man named Jack Johnson has a fight. Many of you all know, Damon knows, Jack Johnson. He's fighting against Sullivan and a lot of others. So he fights, and does anybody know whether you like boxing or not? Historically, the greatest athlete in the world has been considered the heavyweight champion and the decathlon, the person who wins the decathlon. Well, Jack Johnson is a big, beautiful man, and he fights Sullivan and fights a lot of others, and he beats them. And blacks cannot go to the theater to the rings. So they have in movie theaters, blacks go to these movie theaters and hear this, and you have this, and Jack Johnson becomes, if you've seen the thing with James Earl Jones, the Great White Hope, where Jack Johnson is the Great Black Hope, and he goes and he fights, and the racism comes out. The Washington Post has the worst foul racist articles about this black blue fighting here. And as I put in the book, it might as well have been the Decatur Dixie. The Washington Post may have been one of these southern newspapers, and they in the Washington Post. By the way, not long after that, when they riots in 1919 in Washington, the Washington Post puts out an article: all white men should meet at the corner here at 13th and F and join so they could stop black people, black soldiers who are coming to Washington. So you have the many of these sports, and then, of course, baseball comes to Washington, and Washington later on is the last team to actually integrate. Washington, as you know, the Washington baseball team refused to integrate. They go to Minnesota, and then they go from Minnesota to Texas with George Bush Jr. At any rate, you have this. Now, in the midst of this, you have something called the Homestead Grays, and these are the teams owned by a man named Posey, who comes to Washington and has a team in Washington and in Pittsburgh. And they have the old Negro leagues. And these teams become the greatest. And they have Buck Leonard, and they have Cool Papa Bell, and all that, these names. These guys have, they have these sweet names. And so they come, and and when blacks cannot go to Griffith Stadium, which is where the Howard Hospital is now, to watch the white teams play, they form their own teams and they win. And do you know that they have more people coming to their games than do the whites? And create just a big stir. And they win a championship in 1941 and 42. Of course, many baseball players, Jackie Robinson. Just come back to Jackie Robinson. I'll come back to this if I forget, because you see what they've done with Jackie Robinson and taking his name off some of the banners at the Pentagon. Now they've had to put them back. Well, anyway, in World War I, this time, people, right after World War I, a little later on, Jackie Robinson, other people, a lot of baseball players go, Joe DiMaggio, and everybody, goes to play. Well, you have this going on. Now, the Washington teams refused. Now, the other team that refused to integrate is the Washington, you know the name of the Redskins. And the Washington team doesn't refuse to integrate, even when the Los Angeles Rams and others do. And so the Washington team, the great sports writer Thomas Boswell says, the Washington Redskins has no Negroes and they have no victories. And they said the Washington Redskins end zone is often integrated by the other team who's the integrated end zone. They're winning, and this team never wins. And then, of course, later on, they get Bobby Mitchell and Charlie Taylor and others. Does anybody know what the great rivalries in sports are in Washington? Dallas Cowboys, and why is that? Would anybody know why? Because the Washington team refused to integrate. The Dallas Cowboys in the old American Football League, and the Washington team is in. And as growing up as a kid in Newport News, we were all Baltimore Colts fans. Lenny Moore, Big Daddy Lipscomb, Johnny Unitas, Raymond Berry, all these things. And so we know, at any rate, but in Washington, the team would integrate, so all the people from North Kakalaki, North Carolina, become Dallas fans. You go to Georgetown University on any Monday, or go to a Giant store on any Monday, and you ever go, what do you see? You see people just bantering. Half people have on Dallas Cowboys clothes, and half people have on of the old Washington team. Even though the team has changed its name, people have and people not getting rid of their paraphernalia, their jackets, and they just make cover over. So anyway, but there's this great banner, and why? Because the Washington team refused to integrate, and so many people, 90%, became Dallas fans, and it's still true today. Today is a bit different because D.C. is so gentrified that people come from Boston and places like that, and they keep their old teams, and so you have that big battle that's going on in sports, and then you have the other aspect of what sports can do. A man named E.P. Henderson comes, he's from Washington, grew up in West Washington, and goes up to Boston and studies under a man named Naismith. And as you watch basketball now, you know the trophy is named the Naismith Trophy and the Naismith Hall of Fame and all this. Anyway, E.P. Henderson goes there, and he comes back and forms the first black recreation league, and he's the one who puts recreation in the D.C. public schools there. And first he coaches young ladies, and he coaches basketball, and he can't get black guys to play basketball. He says they have too much. It's his words. They have too much testosterone. They don't want to have any structure. And he finds that if you watch the latest game, you watch Juju and others, you see the beauty of the game, but at a certain point, African Americans, young boys did love the game, and he formed leagues at the True Reformers Church, which is over by True Reformers Building, which is like 11th and U Street. So he formed this league, and Howard University has a team of doctors, the Harlem Wrens, which is the name of the Harlem Wrens. All these teams come, and they form and they play along U Street, and then Duke Ellington, is playing his own. Duke Ellington said, "I thought I was a good athlete. But then I saw in playing the pianos, the girls like piano players. So I gave up playing basketball. And he became, of course, who he is now, Duke Ellington. But at night, the teams would go and play basketball. The teams would play basketball until about 8 or 9, and then they would take this gym in the True Reformers Church at 11th Street and turn it into a dance hall. And so music and sports, again, aligned there. And then, of course, basketball came to America, and I write in this book that 3 of the great legends come out of Washington, D.C. The greatest, Elgin Baylor. He's born at 11 or 12 o'clock. His father looks at his Elgin watch. He has an Elgin watch and sees, and so he names his son Elgin Baylor. The next is Dave Bing. Both of them kind of spring on high school. And then there was a man named John Thompson, who was a great high school player, and he plays at St. Anthony's School and plays at the Catholic leagues integrate before. But as he goes to up Chevy Chase, when they want to play weekend games, and he's in school with Monk Malloy becomes the Catholic priest who becomes the president of Notre Dame. And there, the teams can play together in the Catholic leagues, but they cannot play. The schools aren't integrated until 1954. And so, and in the midst of all this, John Thompson goes off, later on he goes off and he plays at Providence. And he has a story very similar to Louis Armstrong's. Louis Armstrong was he was a waif, which means he was raised in an orphanage, and he had been adopted by a family called the Kosofskis, and every day he wore a Star of David. And And John Thompson, when he played up in Boston, when he's drafted, they can't find places to play. There's nowhere for you to stay for black people. So he stays in Marty and Rolf's house up in, and they're another Jewish family. He stays there. So in the midst of all this, Thompson develops a consciousness about things. And in the midst of this, as they're playing these summer league games, they go up and integrate the recreational league in Chevy Chase. And who comes down to watch them every Sunday? He lives in Washington, D.C., a man named Red Auerbach. Red Auerbach is, of course, the great coach with the Boston Celtics. My son went to school up here, St. Albans, and he said, Dad, Red Auerbach came to school. Do you know who he is? Of course I know Red Auerbach. You know. He said, guess what he told us? He said, if you want to win, it's one lesson you have to have. I said, what is it? He says, cheat. And what he meant was that in the old Boston Gardens, they cut down the heat, or they let the water leak, or the towels were different. Well, these are lessons that you learn in sports. Did he mean I don't know. But Red Auerbach came and made sure that these young teams, these young black and white people, started all around something at the same time. Around that time, a little bit before, music has this, maybe a few years before, has this trend of integrating. And it happens on Massachusetts Avenue at the Turkish Embassy under two men, Ahmed and Neshri Erdogan. And these are young men whose father, Mumir Erdogan, had been the first ambassador under the Ataturk regime when Ataturk overthrows the Ottoman Empire. And as they come, they had heard Ella Fitzgerald and Sinatra and all those at the Royal Albert Theatre in London at the Palladium. So they hear this music, they're very young, and they come to Washington, and the chauffeur's named Cleo Payne, and they sneak out at night to go hear music. And the father finds out, he's a devout Muslim. He finds out, and he says, no. So you can't do this, but why don't you bring the musicians here? So starting in the mid to late 1840s, they started bringing all the great musicians to the embassy. Cootie Williams, Marion Anderson, the great trombonist Jack Teagarden, all the great music, and they go there to Turkish Embassy and they play until the wee hours of the morning. So one day, this Southern senator, I don't know what his name is. I really can't find it. It's either Stennis or Eastland. Those of you who may be old enough to know them. You know, here's the thing about age when you throw out names. I throw out names to my students, and they look at me and say, Professor Jackson, we don't know who they are. I say, well, look, I didn't live when Beethoven was playing a Bach, but I know who they are. So you can learn these names. And this is and so what happens is, and so the white man comes over and said, Ambassador, you've had Negroes come in the front door. You cannot do this in Washington, D.C. And Ambassador said something very similar to what my grandmother would say. She would make me read her the Bible every night, and she had a third grade education. But she said, now, boy, I don't need you to interpret, just read the thing. And I'd read the Bible, and it was just one verse she loved. In my father's house, there were many mansions. If it were not so, I would not have told you. And the ambassador, using the Islam, using the Quran, quoted something very similar and said, this is my house, and this is my mansion. In my mansion, people come as I wish, and they may come through the front door. But if you want to go through the back door, sir, you may. And the embassy stayed. Now, in the midst of all this, as these great musicians, these guys are trying to figure out how to take the music more. So what they do, unbeknownst to the people at 16th and R Street, which is 1538 R Street, which is a center there. Anybody know what's there? Well, these two Muslim guys go out and find a place to play black music. It's the Jewish Community Center. And here this music is the first publicly integrated. And I often say to my friends, if we had such cooperation today, maybe we'd be in better shape. Unfortunately, we don't. And so they brought the music, then they started playing at the National Press Club and all these places. And of course, the Voice of America and things are promoting this music all over. It's really something, I see the Voice of America is being closed with. Now look, I come of the generation where you had different views about all this. But the fact is that the Voice of America and people were promoting jazz throughout the world. So we had all of these events coming at the same time. In the midst of all this, and I'll say only a few other things, in the 1950s, late 1950s, one of the most integrated places in the CC is Lord Prison. And why? Because you had gangsters, you had there, and they're black and white, and they're men and women. Later on, we know that Baby Robusto, and we know that a lot of the Watergate people ended up there. Well, 1957, a priest named Father Brightmiller decided to have concerts at Lorden Theater, Lorden Prison. And I used to go out there and teach. So, and he would bring the greats. He brought in. For the first time, Ella Fitzgerald and Frank Sinatra sang together on the same thing. And Walter Cronkite comes in for 60 minutes, before 60 minutes for CBS, and he says, "Oh, Blue Eyes, Sinatra, could be anywhere he wants to be, but he's chosen to be here." And they have these great concerts. Sarah Vaughan, Pee Wee Reese, is not the baseball player, but the gentleman. And all these people come in, and then concurrently, after they have these concerts until the 1960s, and then concurrently, they have them at the Carter Barron Theater. Now think about this, the two federal government institutions, both closed now, are places that had free music for people. And they would have these concerts for the Carter Barron, where all these greats would come in free until 1968. 1968, the riots came, and what happened? The whites who had gone to the Carter Barron refused to come in. So you want to know why the Kennedy Center and all the Meriwether Post Pavilion, all those created in the aftermath of the 1968 riots. And so music, lastly, we can ask questions. Let me just say this. There are a few events that have brought black and white people together in Washington. They've always been either music or sports. The music adventures of Marian Anderson, of others. You had so many people like Shirley Horn and others, Buck Hill. You know the big picture of Buck Hill at 14th and U Street. These musicians who refused to leave, but they played a great role in bringing music and culture to Washington, but also a great role in bringing people together. Now, I've been here a long time, and I say the only time in my lifetime that I've ever seen unity amongst the races, in general, has been when the Washington team won in 83, 87, 93, when they won those championships with 3 different quarterbacks. And Laura and I, it's just, you started going together then, or maybe you go out on Adams Morgan, you go out in the street, thousands of people unite and come together, black and white. If you saw when the hockey team wins, you don't see any black people going to the hockey. You just don't watch hockey. The reason black people don't watch hockey, because hockey is only fun if you can see it in person. But if you see it on TV, it's so slow, you don't know what. And then when the Georgetown team won in 1984, when they won, the city came together. At the Smithsonian, there's a picture of Patrick Ewing. When Patrick Ewing came to Georgetown, the white students threw bananas and things at him, and then they started winning. And then, things changed under the great John Thompson. And these things, the only other thing I ever know that has brought people together like that has been these two events, the anti-apartheid movement, where blacks and whites all united on Massachusetts Avenue, and the struggle for rent control, where you would have rich and poor, old and young, from the Kennedy Warren up Connecticut Avenue all the way down to Costa Unite. And so this book tells a story about all those. I end the book with 2 great people. One is Gil Scott-Heron. They have a poem that he's written about this is the city for all the world to see. It's the nation's capital is Washington, D.C., and he's talking about the segregation of Washington. The other is Sweet Honey in the Rock, where the group come together. And in 1973, they have a song, We Who Believe in Freedom Will Not Rest. And this song comes out at the same time, 1973, that D.C. gets home rule. And so we look at this role of these great musicians who played there. And there's so many others. Well, I could go on and on and on, but I'll stop with that. And then if anybody has any questions or disagreements or enlightenment, please tell me.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring around a microphone.
Yes, Glenn.
What surprised you most? What surprised you most when you were researching this book, or what was your favorite delight?
My favorite delight really is understanding the great appreciation for Louis Armstrong. I tell you why. I knew a bit about it, but in 1957, in the midst of the Little Rock boycott, and the great Rockwell painting and these whites throwing eggs and things at these young black girls in their pigtails and their white dresses, and they're walking to school. And Eisenhower calls Louis and said, Louis, you have to go to Moscow. You have to tell them that they have to stop this propaganda about America, this racist nation and all this. And what was happening? It was in the middle of Sputnik. So the Soviets were beating them at space. And Eisenhower said, the man who the world knew more than anyone was Louis Armstrong. See, understand this about sports. If you look generally at periods of time, the most well-known person in the 40s is Joe Louis. In the 50s, it's probably Louis Armstrong. In the 60s, it's Ali. In the 70s, it's Jordan and Jackson. So you have these trends. And so, but in the 50s, Louis Armstrong was known throughout the world because of his music and his message. And so Eisenhower gets Joe Glazer, who's his manager, and he's a real money grubber, and gets him on the phone and says, "You got to tell Louis, he's got to go and tell the Russians this isn't true. It's the Cold War, African liberation. All these African countries are becoming liberated. The Soviets make gestures to all these countries. America refuses to. Whatever the reasons are, they make gestures. They open up embassies all over Africa. America refuses to. So anyway, and Louis Armstrong does what? When he calls him again, he says, Louis, he wakes him up. He's in the middle of a sleep. He wakes him up. And Louis wakes up, and Glazer says, the general's on the phone again. He said, tell the motherfucker I'm not going. Now, why did he say this? Because every day before he gets up, Louis Armstrong does, I don't advise it, young people, but Louis Armstrong smokes 2 joints every morning as soon as he gets up. This is Louis Armstrong. He said he had glaucoma, maybe. But who's going to bother Louis Armstrong? And so, but that's in finding out and learning to appreciate musicians, like Shirley Horn and Buck Hill, who stayed home to make a living. They could go to New York, and then Shirley Horn is discovered by Miles Davis. And Miles Davis, and there's just so many stories. And then the stories of blacks who during this period, and this is in the bigger book, who makes us sacrifice to this country, and who were just denied. The city now is more segregated than any time. I've been here a long time, 50 years. The city is now more segregated than when I came here. Few black kids go to school with white kids. 90% of the white kids just go with whites, 90% of black. And these things here. But I also discovered something else, was that in the midst of this, in the 1980s and 1990s, when Mr. Reagan is making budget cuts, the first thing he made budget cuts to were sports programs and music programs. So he cut all the PE out of schools. And what happened when he cut the PE out of schools? Kids get fat in the Bronx. In the Bronx, South Bronx, and in Washington D.C., diabetes rates goes way up. And they've taken music out of school, and they took PE out of school. When they took music out of school, what happened? Phenomenal thing happened in the 90s. Rap and hip hop come because people don't have instruments. They aren't playing. When I was a kid, everybody played. So they pick up buckets. Anybody know what a drywall bucket is? Drywall bucket. When I was a kid, you either drywall or you go to House of Prayer. The House of Prayer is the Pentecostal church. They pass buckets around to collect money. And kids get this, and then they started using their voices. And they understand the importance of scat. Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. Zee-ba-da-ba-doo-ba-da-ba-doo. You just scat. And what happened? Louis Armstrong is playing, and he loses a sheet of paper. So he takes it up, and to keep the music going, he scats. And these young people take this music, and they take different things, and they make music of their own, like the African tradition. See, they've done this in the midst of these hardships. And so there's so many lessons like this you learn, but also you learn the spirit of the individual. You also learn that, we've had plenty of hard times. The hard times come hard, we find that in music is a song, there's a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Music won't get you freedom. You might think it is an idiot. It won't do that. But what will music do? Music can soothe the soul, and sports can soothe the soul in trying times. And that's why today I was looking at Wednesdays I stay home. and work, and I work. And I take an hour, and Laura's retired, so she can hear me upstairs, and I look at a sports show. I look at, she thinks he's loud, but I look at Stephen A. Smith, and he is rather loud, but you know, the cat's making $20 million a year, so I guess loud pays off. Anyway, so in the midst of this, there was a show came on, and they had LeBron James on. So I don't have time for this, but I said, let me listen to this man talk for an hour. And what I realized was that how a person who I saw speak 20 years ago with Carmelo Anthony, and when Larry Bird and Magic Johnson interviewing him, he says, oh no, we don't have anything to do. We don't care about civil rights and all this. And then to see this man through the sports develop as such an articulate spokesman of people. And he says, what gets me through life is sports and music. And I think, maybe Jackson, maybe you have something here. There's so many lessons that you learn. In our house, you know, we were a working class house, and the thing we did, our kids both had to play music and sports. It helped them get through school. It helped us, you know, cope. It made them joyous. And so I think those are some of the lessons I learned in that minute. So, yes, sir.
Thank you for this presentation. Often when you hear people talk about the connection between music and sports, people often tie them to African American culture, in particular this idea of improvisation. You mentioned Elgin Baylor. Elgin Baylor, anybody who's playing basketball today is influenced by Elgin Baylor, and he really creates this sort of African American style of play. But I don't know the way in which he's connected to music. Would you agree with that sort of assessment,
Yeah.
that sports and music best personify these sort of improvisational ideas of African American culture?
Thank you, Dan. Well, it's true, but let me just say this. Often when people look at African American musicians and sports people, they think that everything is just initiative, that everything is just comes from the heart. And so what they don't realize is that people study, and that the great musicians like James Reese Europe had a great saying. He said, I have studied all the melodies of the world, and the only melodies that really make sense to me are the Russian melodies and African American, which means he had studied. Do you know that that he had studied Shirtak? He studied so many musicians, and he had and Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington writes all these songs, and Duke Ellington, but he studies the music of all the Tchaikovsky. He studies everything. They study the music of the great Czech composers. And same thing with music, with athletes. When you look at these great athletes, do you know that LeBron James is like Tom Brady? They know every play they've run for the last 30 years. And they compare him. So he's thinking about this play. He's thinking about where this man is. He's thinking about how to room the ball. I don't know if you watch basketball or not. You know, the athletes are so much, you know, who knows they're better, but they have learned physics. They've learned how to spin balls this way and that way that the great players never really thought about. They learned it. And so music and sports, in this sense, is innovative, but also people have to really study it. And African-American musicians, especially the problem is now is that, especially in sports, because people, don't stay in college and they keep training, going back and forth. Sometimes they don't learn the skills like we would hope they learn skills. But when you see some athletes now do some of the things, do you know, for example, tennis and golf? You can become a good tennis player, a good golf player, but if you don't get training, you're not going anywhere. You cannot learn to play golf by yourself. You just can't. It's too much. I don't know how to play golf. My wife said, why don't you take up a hobby? Well, why would I take up a golf? I'm going to be bad at it. At this age, I don't want to do anything. I'm going to be bad at it. I'm already struggling. So, but when you look at the Williamsons, they learn how to cream and spin the ball and all those things, golfing lessons. And so African Americans are very much the same way. And so they have studied these things, art and sports. They studied. And the thing about black musicians and sports people is that they don't care who did it. The notion of the black sports people who watched Pete Maravich, they saw him do something, they would take it. If Duke Ellington says there are only two kinds of music, good and bad, but he said great music. He said there are two kinds of musicians too, and he said good musicians borrow, great musicians steal. And that's just pretty much the same thing that Red Auerbach says. Say, who creates anything new? Maybe Picasso talks about how he stole from the Africans and things like that. So sports and music has that they're innovative. But people think because blacks are good at it, and all blacks are not good at it. Some are good. I wasn't good at sports and music, but that doesn't mean I can't love it. And so so when people talk about the great musicians, and they see a musician who's a prevalent, someone who's very good at sports, they just think it's but this person has studied. Marian Anderson studied. She just didn't learn Italian. She had to study, and the same thing with sports. So it's a mixture of both, and that shows to the creativity of a people. So. None of my ex-students have any questions to ask me. If you're in class, if you didn't ask me something, you're gonna leave out here with a D. None of them got D's, of course. These were the great students. So. Yes.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about a book that I read concerning Russian emigre music and how the different waves of Russian emigres would come to New York and they would despise each other or not pay. But the place where they would, the space where they met and eventually interacted and even integrated with each other, the first wave after the Russian Revolution, the second wave after World War II, the third wave in the 70s and 80s, and now the fourth wave in the 90s, was music. That music was the center. It was a space that was free to all and where people's emotions overcame their social and political and economic differences. Yeah. So yes, music seems to have that kind of
We know who brought this was the great Antonin Dvorak. Mm-hmm. And Dvorak had come from Czechoslovakia, and he says there's this great music of the Negro folk melodies. And he brought together his music with that, and then he worked with a person named Harry Burleigh, who was the first great black composer, Will Marion Cook. And of course, you know that many of the great Russian writers, Berlin and many others, had come. They were great songwriters. They were great, and the black musicians went to them. There's a great story about Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker, he had a drug problem, and one night, whose door is he knocking on? Igor Stravinsky, because he really, Rite of Spring, he really wants to know how Stravinsky played this. And so you have this, these great things. Music did that, If you listen to some of the great musical compositions of Charlie Parker and others, they take the music and they flatten it, change the notes, but they've used a lot of Broadway tunes. And they take these Broadway tunes from a lot of former Russian composers, Sir with the Fringe on top, all of those. They take this music and change it and give great credit. They studied with the great, European, everything from Toots Thielemans to others. They don't listen to Kenny G. If you know who happened, that is because he's taking music. But Charlie Parker and others, he had a great appreciation of country western music. Country western music. Do you know who listened to music of the world more than anyone? Well, two people, probably Liberace and how did Liberace? Because Liberace and what's the other one's name? He wore all the flashy stuff. It'll come to me. But Liberace had this Lawrence Welk, and they had this show. And Lawrence Welk listened to everything, all the music of the world, and then he has on Saturday night. And my grandmother was a watchwoman. She didn't watch TV, but at night, on Saturday night, she'd watch Liberace and Lawrence Welk, and then she'd watch the Texaco Hour, which is classical music, listen to it, and then she'd watch the fights. That's the one night she would. And so you have all this coming in, and that's all you can listen to. But Lawrence Welk would listen to the music of all this, and he had this great thing. He said, now we're going to play this great song of Duke Ellington, Take A Train. You get it? Take the A Train, take A, he didn't. And so you have, this, but, and so blacks inadvertently are listening to all this Russian and other, but they don't really know exactly who it is, but but the great ones, Charlie Parker and others, and then they take the folk melodies of the old Irish and Scottish folks, ditties and things like that, and put them all together. Jazz is made up of these compositions. It's made up of African polyrhythms in New Orleans. It's made up of the European march music, which is Polish. If you ever listened to a Russian dirge, a song, you ever listened to it? Have you ever listened to a Russian? Have you ever listened to a New Orleans funeral music? It's almost the same thing. You just have to listen to it. It's almost the same thing. Have you listened to it? I don't know. It's sad music when I went down, but if you listen to it, it's almost the same thing. I've looked at them. I've looked at Russian funerals. I've looked at black funerals. I've looked at the music, and the dirges are not that much different. Of course, different innovation things like that, but coming from the same thing. And so and then the European march music and all this. So I think it all, has great. And then of course, music, especially music that comes through the folk tales and the folk music and the folk music. I was in Russia many times. I saw something called the Mosiev dances, which were dances from all the different regions of the country. And then I've looked at when African Americans put together all these. It's not that much different. You just appreciate it. Lastly, if you listen to the soul of a music, you hear a lot of country music, country western. And why is this part of it? Because African Americans from the South had nothing to listen to on the radio. So you listen to all this, the influence come in, Ray Charles and others. And so it's just a big melting pot of different cultures. Listen to some of the, they call it third stream. Third stream is music that came in America in the 1970s. Keith Jarrett and people like that. They studied Brahms, they studied all the Brandenburg Concerto, they studied all the European classical music, and they incorporated in their jazz. So it's, the big thing is now that the young musicians, like the young athletes, are very well trained. There's some great young jazz musicians coming out here now. Anybody listen to anybody ever listen to Samara Joy? You ever listen to some of these? Oh man, and now we're saying where the great, they're out there. We just don't have the venues. And so I talk about in this book how the two great venues in my time in D.C. are the Bohemian Cabins and Twins, and both were closed. And why they closed during their COVID. And it's to the stupidity of the leaders of the city, because they could have saved Bohemian Cabins. Today, yesterday, let me get how we can be stupid sometimes. I read in the paper today, I brought it. And I don't know why I'm picking on this man, but I brought it. And it says, see, sometimes we just don't get serious. Anyway, it says, here it is. McDuffie, this is the city council, introduced a bill to designate D.C. as the nation's official sports capital. Now, how could you be so dumb? D.C. is not Boston. It's not New York. It's not Philadelphia. You go to Philadelphia, man, you're going to fight over a game. Yeah, man, you fighting. You go to Boston. But this is all this man got to do. Instead of trying to save the city, instead of trying to keep these clubs open, now, he did introduce a bill that made go-go the official music, so he did something. But this is just stupid. It was too late for me to put it in the book. But he's a good guy. He just, sometimes he's a politician. So, yes, this is my good friend Lee Davis out of Chicago, Illinois, graduated of 2019.
Okay, here, we'll take one more.
You spoke on Dave Bing.
Yeah.
He used sports to elevate him to politics. You spoke on Gil Scott-Heron. Obviously, before the drugs, it was a lot of revolutionary music. We got young people in Ward 7 and 8 who are invested in music and sports as well, who don't know the history that comes from this city. How do we push this to these young people in Ward 7 and 8 who aren't knowledgeable of the rich history of sports and music in D.C.?
Well, we use people like you to do it. See, you take it. See, but so there's a new go-go museum in Ward 8, and Moden and many others, and the Peacemakers, and they've made
Ron Moden?
Yeah, Ron Moden and the Peacekeepers, I think that's what he's called.
Okay.
and they've started something called the Go-Go Museum, and it's become an official museum of Washington. And so just look that up, and I haven't been, but they have concerts. They have Cynthia Kane. She lives. Talk to this lady here. She lives in Watergate, and they have events. And now a good friend of mine, his name is Gio Roscianello, and Gio is one of the great young writers, and he writes for the New York Times. And every couple of weeks, he has something called 5 Minutes to Make You Listen to Music. It's a fascinating series because he has a great author. Anyway, he's writing a book on Gil Scott-Heron, and Gil Scott-Heron, of course, became addicted. And you know, when I first came to D.C., I tell you, some things were backwards, but at UDC where he was, you could go hear a lecture. You could hear a lecture from Gil Scott-Heron, hear his music. You can go to a lecture of Ira Berlin, the great anti-slavery writer, C.L.R. James, the great Caribbean leader, who I sometimes would go to his house for high tea on Friday, and David Leving Lewis, the man who wrote the great books on Du Bois. So you had all this around Federal City. Where Gil Scott-Heron was there, and he was the one who probably was the great poet, music. So, but there are things that people have done. D.C. is, but here's the thing. Georgia Avenue. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago. Maybe you lived there on Georgia Avenue. The gentrifiers who moved in did not want people to play go-go music. They went to Howard University and walked their dogs. And when somebody at Howard say, "Stop walking your dog and letting them defecate," they say, "Move the university." This is like crazy. You're gonna move hundreds of acres. You see, this is the nature of what gentrification has done. And the city has not done enough to preserve the old culture and the new. So the last thing I say. So about 15 years ago, a bunch of buddies and I, we get together and listen to music on once a month. And we took a picture in front of a mural in a building on the block. It was called after Duke Ellington. So what the gentrifiers did, they took the mural down. They created a building. They called it Ellington. They named the building the Ellington. And then the rent's $5,000 a month. So you can't go, and they say, "Well, I'll give you 2 units for people who make under the median income," which is 50% of the median income, which is $100,000, which would be like $50,000. So you can't live there. And so this is how gentrification works. So, but people are trying to do something. It's just not enough. I'm afraid that if we don't move very quickly, it'll be too late.
Maurice, thank you.
Thank you.
Politics and Prose community, thank you. We could listen to Maurice all night. He's going to sign his book over here. Read the book. The conversation continues. Thank you. We have 3 locations. We do author events every night. Thank you for your support.
Thank you. Thank you. And on April 30th, you all are all my guests. There's going to be a special event at Blues Alley. So it's going to be a special event on this book. So all come. Bring your friends. Bring your thirst.